Hi everybody, welcome to Catherine Sews. Thanks so much for joining me today. So these days I'm noticing that so many people are learning to sew but are not yet learning how to use a store-bought pattern. If you've been getting some sewing skills and you're feeling more and more confident in your sewing, then maybe it's time you jump into the world of store-bought patterns. So in today's video, I'm going to kind of take you through some of the more confusing, maybe even intimidating details about using patterns so that it frees up that whole world to you. There's so many patterns, either ones like this that you buy in a fabric store or PDF patterns that you can buy online. In this video, I'm going to be concentrating more on the store-bought patterns, not so much on the PDF. You know why? Because they're not my favorite. I really don't like having to print it all out and tape them all together. I have done it, it's fine. I know a lot of people that sew that love PDF patterns, but I don't have that kind of patience. So I like to use store-bought patterns because there are so many styles available and you can easily adjust these to make whatever style you want. So why not? Today I'm going to be showing you some of the instruction pages and some of the little signs and details that are commonly found on store-bought pattern. Because sometimes they can be confusing and they can be intimidating. So I want to take out the confusion and the intimidation for you so that you can buy your fabric, buy your pattern, and sew it up and be successful. So this is actually going to be a 3-part series all about getting to know sewing patterns. And as I go through the information today, I'm going to be zeroing in more and more on this pattern, McCall's 8070. It's just the perfect hoodie pattern, perfect for beginners. It's just a simple pullover hoodie, no zipper. It's got the kangaroo pocket, the drop shoulder, and it fits really nicely, and it can be made for both men and women. For men, you might want to make it just a couple inches longer maybe and longer in the sleeve. It fits really nicely, so I highly recommend this one. And it is out of print, but there are still some available online, so I'm going to put the link in the description below. Grab it while you still can. So in my next video, part 2 of this series of getting to know sewing patterns, I'm going to take you through laying out your pattern pieces and cutting out this hoodie. And then in part 3 of the series, we'll sew it up. It'll be fun and you'll get some good skills, and most importantly, you'll gain some confidence in working with commercial patterns. So if you want to sew along with me in part 3 of this series, order your pattern now, buy your fabric, and then you'll be ready to cut and sew. And hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you know as soon as those videos come out. And when they are out, I'll link them below and at the end of this video as well. The main things I'm going to take you through today are choosing your view, choosing your size, which really can be confusing, and I'll take you through the pattern markings and the different kinds of layouts that come on the instructions and whether or not you need to stick to those or not. So it's a lot of information, and we're not really going to be sewing today at all, but becoming familiar with store-bought patterns so that you can sew on your own. For beginners, I recommend sticking with Simplicity, McCall's, Butterick, New Look. These are all great for beginners. I don't really love Burda and Vogue for beginners. Burda is just kind of quirky the way they do their markings and things like that. They're just a little strange sometimes. And Vogue, even if it says very easy Vogue, it is deceptive. That looks like it would be a very easy dress, but when you see the shapes inside, you realize that that is a much more complicated way of doing what is essentially a princess line dress. There are easier ways for sure. Vogue patterns are just more advanced. There's just a lot more steps, and I would say the same with Burda. When you select your pattern, you're going to start just by looking at the outside of the envelope, and you'll see usually there's a photograph, and then there's usually fashion illustrations as well. And from here you can choose your view. The different options, they're called views, view A, view B, and you can mix and match. You can say, okay, I want the pocket from B, but I want the hood from D. You know, you can mix and match. That's not a problem at all. You just kind of have to keep your wits about you when you're cutting, that you've got your pieces that you need for those various parts. Watch also the size range here. Not all patterns have all the sizes, so this one has small, medium, and large, and that's fine. But some have just a more limited size range. This one goes from extra small to medium, and this one goes from large to double XL. So if you're not sure if you're a medium or a large, it makes it a little bit tricky as to know which pattern to buy. And I'll talk more about sizing later because that can be quite tricky. On the back there are technical flats. That's what we call that kind of illustration where it's just a flat garment, no body, no color, but it shows the details of the garment.
For something like this, if you're not sure if there's a zipper or if it just goes over your head, the technical flat can give you a little bit more of an indication. There would be like a heavier line at the side or a center back seam if there was a zipper. So I can see from this one that this goes over the head. You'll also see suggested fabrics, and that's super important. Not the whole list of fabrics, I just don't find that super important, but this very first thing, moderate stretch knit. You cannot make this in a woven fabric that's not going to stretch. It won't go over your head. And so that's really the only thing that's important to me in this whole section. For this one that can be made out of either a woven or a knit, in the fabrics, gauze, cotton blends, challis, the whole list I don't find that helpful. All I need to know is if it's woven or knit, and that's listing some woven fabrics. I can for this one, I could easily use a silky knit and that would work just fine. There's nothing in this that's structured like darts and a zipper. A knit would be okay for this. Sometimes you can go that way. One that's made for wovens can be made up in a knit, but not the other way around. You can't take something that's made for a knit and put it into a woven. So, for example, this one too, the list of fabrics, moderate stretch knits. I cannot make this in a woven fabric and get it over my head. I'd have to add a zipper and maybe darts. It's just not worth trying. Something like this one, suggested fabrics, double-faced or reversible fabrics only. Double-faced fleece, so that's a knit. Wool types, fleece, so this one can be either. Right? It takes a little bit of knowledge of fabrics to know that you're choosing the right kind of fabric. But I find that the people that work in fabric stores are super helpful for helping you figure out if the fabric you're buying is going to work with the pattern you've chosen. It also is going to show you on the back any notions you need. And notions, that just means anything like zippers, and in this case it's twill tape like the drawstring, a star applique. Some of these are very optional, right? You don't need to put a star applique. 2 metal grommets, that will be if you want to put the drawstring through. There are different ways of doing that as well though, so some of the notions are optional. But for something like this one that has a zipper and probably interfacing, the notions are not optional. I like that this shows you a picture here on the Berta. It shows you the interfacing, zipper, even the trim. It shows you what kind of thing you'll need. Okay, there's some points for Berta. Another thing that's on the back of any pattern that uses knits, there's going to be this line here. So 4 inches of crosswise folded knit must stretch from here to here. So if I take this folded, if I pinch from here to here, that needs to be able to stretch. This one I cannot stretch it. So this looks like perfect hoodie fabric, but it has very little stretch. So you could still make it, but just be aware that that's not going to be the comfiest to get on and off. This one looks quite similar, but again, there to there, I can just barely do it. And then this one, which has a higher polyester content, not as much cotton, if I stretch from the 4-inch, easily. This one definitely has enough stretch. It's going to be more comfortable in the stretch, but then you have to balance that out against what you like with the higher content of cotton. But the main information you'll see on the back of your pattern is how much fabric you need to buy. So first you need to choose your view. So that's what the ABCD here is. That's your view. You'll choose your view first. Some fabrics come 45 inches wide and some come 60 inches wide. There are fabrics that are kind of a little bit in between, but that's the general rule, 45 or 60. 45 inches is a little less than I can stretch my arms. 60 is a little more than I can stretch my arms. Usually on the end of a bolt of fabric, it'll tell you the width, but if you're not too sure, just try to stretch it from selvage to selvage. If it's more than you can stretch your arms, it's probably 60, and if it's less than you can stretch your arms, it's probably 45 inches wide. Good. So once you have your view and you know which line you're looking at, am I looking at the 45 inch wide or the 60 inch wide, then I need to figure out my size. And we'll talk about sizing more in a few minutes because that to me is the trickiest. So probably go up a size or 2 just in general when you're deciding how much fabric to get. So if I'm doing view A and I've got 45 inch wide fabric, I'm normally a medium when I buy clothing, but so I would look at the large or even extra large. 2 yards and 5/8 is how much fabric I'd have to buy. If you're a Canadian or European and your store works in metric, for Canadians, even if we don't speak French, we have to go over to the French side, and it's 115 or 150 centimeters wide. Find your size, and it's 2.3 or 2.4 meters. This is helpful sometimes, the finished garment measurements. So it tells you here the width of each leg, back length from base of neck, and side length from waist, so your side seam measurement. So those can be helpful to help you to figure out if you need to do any lengthening or shortening. For C, you would know if you measure from your waist to where you want it to finish, either the pant or the short, those are the measurements that you're looking at in the length there, and that'll help you decide if you want to lengthen or shorten it. Good. Often on the back flap is the price of the pattern. This one is $19.95. This one, which I think is a perfect beginner's pattern, the price is $20.95. So that's really expensive. I mean, you could probably go and buy a hoodie for that price, just for the pattern alone before you've even bought the fabric. You can often get discounts if you buy your fabric with the pattern. You don't always end up having to pay that. Just be aware of that price. Just to emphasize that this pattern, we're going to be keeping all of the pieces for this pattern so that we can make this hoodie again and again. The first time you make it is the hard one. That's when you're figuring it out, you're learning the techniques. After that, the second, third time you make it, it's really easy. So why wouldn't you want to use that again and again? And because that price is so high sometimes, a lot of people who sew don't ever cut up the pattern. They trace it onto different paper. I don't do that, honestly. I can still use the pattern again and again, even if I have cut it up once. I will still reuse it. Also on this back flap are body measurements, and this is where you start to get an idea of what size you're going to be cutting. However, I find this really confusing because look at some of these measurements. So this one, congratulations to McCall's for having reasonable body measurements on here. The waist for the small is 28 to 30. The bust and chest 34 to 36. The hip is 35 to 37. That's a reasonable measurement. That's not bad. But some of them, Butterick's waist measurement for the small is 24 to 25 inches. Who has that? So for me, for my waist measurement, I have to go up into some depressingly large sizes here. The sizes here, they're not the same as what you'd buy in a store. So if you normally buy a 4 to a 6 in a store, you're gonna have to go up 1 or 2 sizes for the pattern that you're going to cut. So this is the second part of the problem with sizing. If you go by your measurements, and let's say your waist is 30 inches, so you cut the large, I often find that if I do that, it's way too big. So I don't often find that these tiny measurements are actually reflective of what's inside this pattern. So I'm going to show you an easier way to just choose your size. We'll come back to that in a minute. So inside there's going to be 2 different kinds of paper. This is the tissue, this is the pattern itself. We'll put that aside for now. And I just want to look at the instruction sheets for a minute. First, it tells you this is page 1 of 3, so I know I should have 3 pages of instructions, and that's actually kind of helpful. There's more tech flats here and the back views as well. Then there's all of the pattern pieces that are shown here, and it's kind of good to familiarize yourself with what your pattern pieces should look like, and they're all numbered, which helps as well. There's a list here of the different pattern pieces and which views use those. So the pocket number 1 is used for view B and D. The front, there's no letters listed here, so I know the front, piece number 2, is for all of them. And then number 3, this pocket is only used for view C. Okay, over here it shows pattern markings, and really the most important ones are the first view, the grain line. So the grain line looks like this. It's an arrow, and that shows us that this line here needs to be placed parallel to the selvage. Sometimes you can get away with turning it, but sometimes you absolutely cannot. And this is a good example of a time you cannot turn that grain line. This is the sleeve band, like the cuff at the bottom of the sleeve. We need this to stretch in this direction. So the grain is really critical. If I was doing a style out of a woven fabric, there is no stretch, if there's no directional print, I can turn it sideways. Let's say if I was dealing with a striped fabric, I could turn that sideways so that I had the stripe following the length of the cuff. That would be fine. But on a knit, you absolutely have to follow that grain line. Now the next one, and this is a point of confusion, and I apologize that this is labeled this way, fold line. I wouldn't even call it that, and I'll tell you why. Okay, first of all, what they're talking about here is this bracketed arrow. It's an arrow that is pointing to the edge and says place on fold. I would call this the place on fold line, because here's what it looks like on the pattern: center front, center back, fold, and when it's the arrow that is bent and pointing to the edge, that line has to be placed right on the fold of the fabric so that it opens out to be twice the size of this, right? So that is quite different from this, and this is the point of confusion I'm trying to tell you. Can you see here where it says fold line? That's completely different. This line here is just where you fold the cuff later. It has nothing to do with when you're cutting or placing your pattern on the fabric. You could absolutely ignore that and not let yourself be confused by it. This, where it says fold, that's what this is referring to. So do you see what I mean? That they should not call that the fold line. But this part's right, place line on fold of fabric, okay? This is just showing where you're going to put buttonholes and buttons. I never actually use these. I just put the buttons and buttonholes where I want it. These are important though. These little triangles, they are notches. The circles are also marking points. Sometimes they're important, sometimes they're not. Sometimes I snip them as if they're a notch. I snip toward them. I'll show you that. So these are the notches. And when you're cutting, you'd cut on your size line and you would just put a little snip, maybe only half as long as that triangle is. You'd put a little snip right there. Sometimes they're important, sometimes they're not. So here's where I do find notches important on a sleeve. When you go to set the sleeve, you'll want to know double notch means the back of the sleeve, and those will match to these double notches on the back of the armhole or arm side. It's really helpful to have those snips when you're sewing because it helps you just match your pieces up. Single notch at the front corresponds to the single notches on the front armhole or arm side. Okay. Now, here's another point of confusion that I wish commercial patterns would do differently. At the top of the sleeve, they put a circle. That circle is meant to align with the shoulder seam. I just cut that as a notch. I just put a little notch right at the top there, just pointing toward those circles, not the whole way, just a little notch right there to indicate that that's the top of the sleeve. And I'm going to be matching that point to the shoulder seam. Okay. Another point of confusion that I hope I can clear up for you are these circles here. Anytime a sleeve has to be eased in, they'll often put circles where you should start your ease, like from this circle around to the other circle on the other side of the sleeve there. If those are important, if the sleeve is like a high cap on a blazer, for instance, then I would mark those. On this pattern, there's not a lot of ease, and so I can ignore those. But where those dots correspond to the dots on the arm side, this gets confusing. Do you see the large, medium, and small? Over here you can see that the dotted line, that's for small, this is for medium, that's for large. So when my students, if they are cutting and they've been following that medium line, then they get to here and suddenly it says large, that's really confusing for a lot of my students. So they don't know where to cut now. I thought this was the medium line, but it says large. It's the circle that they're referring to as the large. That's the medium circle. This is the small circle. And that circle is just where the circle from the sleeve has to correspond. So again, if it was important, if I needed to be easing a sleeve on a blazer, I would just mark this with a notch, just pointing toward my circle. So here's another confusing thing about pattern markings. One of my students was cutting out this skirt and she was following her cutting line, and the cutting line on the dart used the exact same types of dotted lines that the whole perimeter of the pattern used. So she cut out the whole dart. And it's logical that she did that. I totally understood why she did that. But you almost never cut out the dart. But the pattern markings can be quite confusing in that regard. So after the pattern markings, there is also information if you want to lengthen or shorten. And if it is just a straight piece, you can just add and take off from the bottom. It's when the piece changes shape, if it's tapered or flared, then you want to do your lengthening and shortening as the instructions say, where you'll either fold out some or you'll cut it and tape it onto new paper, and then that maintains the shape, either the taper or the flare. Let's come down to the cutting layouts. Again, it goes by view. So let's say I'm doing view D. And so here on all of the views, it shows you which pieces you need. So I need piece 1, 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And so now's the time you can go into the tissue and you can start separating out your pattern pieces. So when I say separating out, I do not mean to cut right on any of the lines. I mean to cut out loosely around the shape, just to separate them out. If there's loads of tissue around your pattern piece, sure, you can cut that off, but this is a very rough, quick cut. We're going to be cutting precisely on the size line, but the best time to do that is when you have it pinned or weighted down onto your fabric. That's the time to be precise. It's actually easier to cut exactly on the line when there is this extra tissue. So don't waste time doing that now. Do it later when you're cutting it out on the fabric. As you're separating out your pattern pieces, I want you to notice the grain lines and the cut numbers. See that bracketed arrow right there? I know that this piece has to be on the fold, and the cut number is cut 1 on the fold. Once in a while, you'll encounter a pattern that says cut 2 on the fold. Let's say it's the skirt part of a dress and the front and back of the skirt are exactly the same. You would need to cut 2 on the fold. The sleeve and the hood. The grain line here is this straight arrow, so I know that piece is not on the fold, and it says cut 2. So I know I'll be cutting this on double layer fabric. The easiest way to find out if this pattern is going to be the right size for you or not is to take a garment that you know fits you and compare the garment to the pattern. I've got a hoodie here that I know fits me, and I've got it inside out, and I'm just going to compare the body of this to the body of the pattern. This is the front piece. There's my center front. So I'll put the center front of the garment on that line. Got my shoulder lined up, and then look, even adding seam allowance, I know I'm safe with cutting the small here, which actually, congratulations to McCall's for getting their sizing really good. Now this hoodie is a small, and it seems to fit exactly like their small on the pattern. So that is a nice thing to see. I can check my sleeve length by just taking the shoulder, putting it to that circle at this point. So I'm not including the seam allowance on the pattern piece. And the cuff is going to be a separate piece. So I think I'm right on track here. Once you have your pattern pieces all separated out, you can start doing your layout. So when you're looking at these layout instructions, which layout is yours? So first of all, it goes by view. So I'm doing D. This is my layout. And for this, it always wants you to be doing this in fleece or sweatshirt fabric. That's always going to be 60 inches wide. There are actually still 2 choices though, even though both of them are 60 inches wide. And the difference is the size range. So this is for the smaller size range, the small to extra large. This is for the larger size range, the double XL to triple XL. It needs a different layout because the pieces are bigger. On something like this one that can be made out of a variety of fabrics, look at the layout instructions here. So we have 2 for 45-inch fabric, so there's the smaller size range in a 45-inch, the larger size range in a 45-inch fabric, and then the 60s, the smaller and the larger size range. So that's why there are 4 different layout possibilities for this one view. Okay, another confusing thing about layout is it often will say with nap or without nap. Napped fabrics are ones where if you brush it one way, it's different from when you brush it the other way. This one, I don't think it has a nap. It feels the same both ways. But something like the fabric in the picture, that might have a nap. If you brush that very furry fabric one way, it might be quite different than if you brush it the other way. And so you want to have it consistent with how you've cut it, because it can look quite different if you've got the front with the nap going up and the back with the nap going down. The other thing to consider when you're thinking about nap, although it's not technically a napped fabric, is if the light hits a fabric differently, going up or down, like a shot silk, or even some different satins will look different if they're hanging up or down, and also a directional print. So do you see how these ones, the dogs go every which way. There's no direction to it. I could cut my fabric up or down, it's not going to matter. But if all the dogs were lined up one way, then I definitely don't want upside down dogs on my garment. So I'm going to put the top of the pattern piece at the top of the print. So because this is going with nap, they're assuming that your fabric has a nap or a direction to it. So you'll see all of the tops of the pattern pieces are facing the same way. They're not flipping things around. On a fabric like this, you really can get away with flipping it up or down, just not sideways. These layouts have been worked out to be as compact as possible. But if your fabric doesn't have a nap or direction, you can flip things up or down, but not sideways. And if you're using the smaller sizes in that range, your pieces might fit in better differently. So you can totally change this. This is just a guide. So that's the first thing, is that this is not carved in stone. You can change it as long as you stick to a few rules. The grain line always goes parallel to the selvage. It's like that. You cannot turn it sideways. But if the pattern piece is going up or down, that's okay, as long as you don't have a direction to your fabric. And the second rule that you cannot change, you still have to have any pieces that are meant to be on the fold need to be on the fold. You cannot change that. If it says to be on the fold, it has to be on the fold. Third, and this is another thing I do not like about commercial patterns, see how it looks like every single piece is touching the edge? It actually should not be. None of the pieces should be touching the edge except for pieces that are meant to be placed on the fold. Fourth, you can change their layout as long as you're doing the correct number of cuts. See how this number 9 has to be used twice, so as long as you do that. So you can change the layout as long as you stick to those 4 rules. The grain line always goes parallel to the selvage. Pieces that are placed on fold go on the fold. And only pieces that are placed on the fold are touching the edge, and you do the right number of cuts. Let's look at the layout in terms of how you're going to fold your fabric. Most layouts are done like this, one fold with the 2 selvages together. So that is called a lengthwise fold. That's like normal. That's usually how your fabric comes off the bolt, and that's just normal. This one they've broken into 2 separate pieces. They've got it on the fold, selvages together just for the sleeve. And the reason for that is you can save fabric by doing this kind of fold. See, the selvages are now in the middle and a fold on each side. So I call that one a window pane fold, where you're kind of coming toward the middle. It's like French doors. Good? So fold and fold, selvages in the middle. That creates 2 folds because you need the front and back both being on the fold. Then the larger size range, those wouldn't fit side by side, so it takes a little bit more fabric. You'd have your front on the fold there, your back on the fold here. This is a different situation where they've got selvage and selvage no fold, so that is just a single layer. And this is one I would personally try to change. If I could, just do it all in the lengthwise fold, because you're cutting your 2 pieces anyway, one with the pattern piece up and one with the pattern piece down, one with the pattern piece up and one with it down. You're cutting everything twice anyway. So if your fabric is a little bit wider, or if your pattern pieces are a little in the smaller range, I would try to do it all on the lengthwise fold, because that's no fun. And here's another situation. Do you see here? That's the fold and the selvage, but selvage and selvage, where your selvages are not together. So you make this fold just big enough to accommodate that piece number 8, that's the biggest one, and then piece 13 would be cut twice from what's left over there. So with your fabric, one selvage goes here, fold, and the other selvage comes up here. And it's that 8 that's the determiner of how big to make that fold. You can start laying out your fabric. You'll get it nice and smooth along the fold. Bring your selvages together if that's what your layout says to do, or I'd say at least try. Start that way, and if you have enough fabric to do it all in a lengthwise grain fold like that, much easier. So you can lay out your fabric. You can start placing down your pattern pieces, grain lines parallel to the selvage. Anything that's meant to be on the fold should be touching the edge. Nothing else should be touching the edge. In the next video, we'll go on to how to pin down your pieces and cutting.
Okay, wonderful. I hope you learned a lot today. I hope you feel a little less mystified by what all of those pattern markings mean. And I hope you're ready to cut and sew with me in the next 2 videos of this series. So I'll see you right back for part 2, where we're going to cut out that hoodie, and then in part 3, where we're going to sew it up. Until then, you take care.